A very warm welcome to our seminar this afternoon. It is part of the ongoing series mounted by the Department of History and Archaeology at the University of Nairobi, with a broad theme of expropriation, governance, and post-colonial modernity in Kenya. For those in this room and those online, karibuni sana to listen to our presenter this afternoon. Now, our presenter this afternoon is Dr. David Neville Masika, and he's going to be speaking on decolonizing heritage, history of World War I, and the absence of African agency. It promises to be a very exciting topic. Now, David Masika is a lecturer at the Department of History and Archaeology, University of Nairobi. He holds a PhD in conflict and peace studies from the same university, and his research interests are on the political economy of wars and global issues that affect world peace. And among them, he seems to lay some emphasis on the issue of terrorism. Now, in this presentation, Dr. Masika will underline the loud absence, or maybe the silence, of the African heritage in the First World War. And from the primary data he collected at the East African Campaign Zone in Taita Taveta, he will demonstrate to us that although Africans were active participants in the campaign, they are absent in the existing physical landmarks that tell the story of the war, and his question is, why? Masika suggests that such silences bespeak of not only imperial racism, but also outright discrimination of the British policy towards its colonial subjects. And he further argues that there is a need to relook at colonial narratives in ways that not only decolonizes colonial historiography, but also centers the much needed African agency in the British Empire building. And therefore, we're going to invite Dr. Masika, but without preempting what Dr. is going to say this afternoon, I think he's nudging us in a way to perhaps adopt a decolonial approach and to see how historical processes of power shape our political, economic, and other outlooks in life. So how do we rediscover? How do we acknowledge? How do we validate? How do we recenter that has been de-centered, especially for the colonized peoples? Thank you. Dr. Masika, karibu.
Thank you very much, my senior, for that wonderful introduction. As my senior said, today I want to speak about decolonizing heritage and history of the World War I, history of World War I, and absence of African agency or the silence of African agency in this war. But there are terms that I wish to define because these terms will be important when I'm speaking about the absence. And maybe the colonizers or the British used these terms to justify to justify what they did of not involving Africans or not putting African marks when it comes to the landmarks that explain the issue of war. The first term that I'll define is followers. And I looked at the English dictionary. It defines followers as a follower as a person who supports and admires a particular person or set of ideas and moves behind that person. I felt important to define this. It's a common term. But then, if you look at the records about Africans' involvement in that war, the British defined them as followers. So my question is, were Africans admiring the bombs? Were Africans admiring the bullets that were flying? That they will follow the Europeans as they fought in that war? And then we ask ourselves, I'll be asking, what about those who are conscripted all the way from Uganda, Western Kenya, Mount Kenya, and taken to the East African war zones of Taveta? Were they admiring and therefore following? Another term is military labor corps, and this denotes to an organization that provides labor for military and related purposes. It may be a civilian auxiliary. So they sometimes referred to Africans as followers as well as military labor corps. Now, as Dr. Gashi said, I'm talking about World War I and the East African Campaign. But then before we understand the World War I, the East African Campaign, we need to ask ourselves, what is the World War I? And therefore, to understand the East African Campaign, we need to understand briefly, because I know this has been written briefly about what was happening in Europe. And why is it that the British and the Germany were fighting here, yet they belong or they come from Europe? And this takes us back to the period between 1884 and 1885, during the scramble and petition of Africa, which actually declared the East African region as a sphere of influence for the British and the German. And therefore, that led the two powers to find themselves in East Africa. And there are several processes that enabled that. Apart from the scramble, there was an agreement between the two powers. And this agreement is the Heligoland Treaty. And I'm putting it there deliberate because it has a meaning. In the Heligoland Treaty, the British surrendered some territories at the East African coast to the German sphere, as the Germany surrendered some spheres or territories in East Africa to the British. And then the British surrendered the Heligoland island in Europe to the Germans. But then how is it important to our topic today? You realize that when the war broke out, in the East African coast, the Germany were able to destabilize the British because they understood the region so well. Starting from Tanganyika all the way to Witu, they understood the terrain so well because they were occupying that region. And it made them
to eject the British easily from the Taveta territories. The British, as I said, it asserted their influence on the East African protectorate, and the Germany were in the East Africa, which became Tanganyika. And after taking over these territories, the British and Germany were interested in developing their territories until things changed in Europe. And this was 1912, when things changed in Europe. And how did these things change? Between 1912 and 1913, war broke out in the Balkans. War broke out in the Balkans when the Serbians conquered the territory of Macedonia and Kosovo. And on June 1914, the Austria-Hungary Archduke Ferdinand and his wife was assassinated. First of all, war has broken up. There's bad blood in Europe. This is not the First World War. There's just bad blood in Europe between the Serbians and the people of Macedonia and Kosovo. But then to add the salt into the injury is that on 28th June 1914, the Archduke Ferdinand and his wife Sophie were assassinated. And when they were assassinated, this triggered a crisis in Europe, in what we call the July crisis. Because throughout that month of July, there was a lot of problems in Europe. Britain trying to come in and play diplomacy to have them solve the issue peacefully, but it seems not to work. And on July 4th, that was July 4th, Kaiser of Germany made a military alliance, which appeared to be a threat at that time. And that there was Hungary and Austria, together they came up into a military alliance to threaten, to send a message in Europe that things were not okay. Austria blamed Serbia for the assassination. See, Austria blamed Serbia for the assassination of the Archduke and demanded to Serbia. Now, Serbia agreed to all the demands, apart from allowing Austro-Hungarian law enforcers to investigate the killing of the Archduke. Britain tried to play its role in diplomacy, but it failed. On July 30th, that's why we said the crisis of July. On July 30th, Nicholas II of Russia ordered military mobilization in preparation. And therefore, there was a lot of tension in Europe. Germany requested Russia not to mobilize and to move its troops away from its borders or closer from its borders. Russia was reluctant and Germany took action. On 1st August, Germany invaded Luxembourg. And at this time, the European powers began to align themselves. They began to align themselves because things were not going all that way well. Germany issued an ultimatum to Belgium to allow its troops to use the Belgian territory to reach France. But then at that level, France could not wait. The war broke out. But that is a brief of what was happening in Europe. Our main interest here is East Africa and the absence of the African agency. Now, if you look at this map, you will see the East African territory where the war was fought. And it's only that it is so small, but you see that we have the Germany positions, Germany where G is Germany, and then the British. So this is the battlefield. When we talk to the East African, we talk about the East African campaign. That is the battlefield, which lies on the territory around Taita Taveta. I say that the war spread into East Africa. The war spread into East Africa, where the British mobilized over 125,000 troops. The British mobilized over 125,000 troops in the territory. Now, I am giving that statistics with a reason. And the reason being, for every British soldier, there were 15 African porters attached to that soldier. So that tells you the number, roughly the number of Africans involved. Because if you have 125,000 British soldiers, each soldier with 15 porters and gun carriers, they'll call them porters, gun carriers, bearers, and medical teams, you realize that that means there was a big number of African presence in that conflict. But then the African is absent when it comes to the landmarks that tell the war, as we shall demonstrate. And if you look at these portraits, you'll see the statistics are even given there of how many Africans were involved. But then, how is it that they are absent when it comes to the landmarks? I'm saying absent because if you go to Taveta, as we shall demonstrate later, and see the war sites, you will not see any symbol of an or any name of an African. Anything that is present there about the African is a pillar and then written on, if you go home, tell them we died for you. Just that, no name and no identity. And that is what worried me to start asking why? Why are the Africans absent? And then I asked myself, how comes, for example, if you go to France, close to the city of Lyon, in a place called Chesley, you'll find that Africans who fought, although this was the Second World War, Africans who were killed in France by the German troops, they are buried in France and their graves are labeled. Their graves are labeled. And that is in France, that the French could identify that Africans were fighting for us, but then they label their names and they allow their family members to visit and pay respect up to now. But then when it comes to the British, the African identity is missing and it's not mentioned anywhere. So I said 120,000 or more than 120,000 British soldiers, each attached with 15 followers. They will call them followers, they will call them porters, they will call them gun carriers. Germany on its part had more than 25,000 troops. And that also will give you the rough estimate of the people from Tanganyika who are attached to the, or who are attached to the Germany troops. Now, my question then will be, how did the war begin in East Africa? How did the war begin in East Africa? I say that on 14th August 1914, 14th August 1914, a British informer alerted the British administration in Taveta that the Germany were preparing to invade the territory, the British sphere of influence. And that the Germany farmers in Tanganyika were recruiting locals and giving them training or military training as part of Schizotrope group. And the British investigated. And later they realized that the German troops were moving closer to the British or sphere of influence. They were moving closer to Taveta. So what will the British do? Before they even send a message, the Germany provoked them. They crossed into Taveta, and after crossing into Taveta, a British soldier fired a warning. He fired in the air to warn them. The Germany responded and fired back. That's when a British soldier by the name Lafontaine fired the first shot. And you'll see when we show the pictures where the first shot was fired and it killed a German soldier by the name Frederick Brocker. That opened the war. That started the East African campaign. So what the British did is they retreated. They evacuated from Taveta and went to Voi, but then started occupying some hills, vantage positions to monitor the Germany. The Germany moved in and took over Taveta. While in Taveta, they began constructing the forts. They began constructing the forts, which are still intact up to now. They start constructing the forts to defend themselves in case the British attacked. At this time, the British are also building forts on various hills, such as Picket Hill and Kasigao. Kasigao's story is very, is a bad one, it's a sad one, but I will also tell it later on. So the British built a fort at Kasigao, which turned into a curse to the people of Kasigao, as I will explain later. From these forts, the Germany launched attacks on British positions. The Germany launched attacks on British positions, including Kasigao, the Kasigao that I have just mentioned. And as they were going to attack the British position in Kasigao, they came across two innocent men who are harvesting honey. Then they asked them, look here, we are looking for our brothers whose skin looks like ours. Ignorantly, the people of Kasigao pointed the position where the British were and said they are on that hill. So the Germany went, attacked, and captured the British, captured 38 British soldiers, and went with them as captives. Now, when the British learned of this, they rounded off Kasigao village. All these people who were there, they burned down the village, rounded off the people, and then took them all the way to Malindi as punishment. But in Malindi, they had misinformed the Giriama that the man-eaters or the cannibals are coming, because they just wanted the Giriama to massacre the people of Kasigao. What the Giriama did, they poisoned some wells so that when these cannibals come, they drink the water and die. Some of them died. But later on, they realized that these people are speaking a language that we can understand. They cannot be cannibals. And that's when now they did not kill all of them. They allowed some of them to come back. So when they arrived in Kasigao, the British, they trekked all the way again back to Kasigao, but then the British had taken over the land. They were not allowed to settle in that land. They were being taken round to Holili, then back, just disrupting or disturbing them. disturbing them. And that has remained a mark to the people of Kasigao. And so the Germany attacked the following areas. They will attack mile 27, which was a British position. Now, mile 27 is important because when the British realized that the porters are not supplying enough, they decided to construct a railway, a military railway. Dr. Ondigi had spoken about it earlier, a military railway. The Voi Taveta railway was strictly a military railway. Now, at mile 27, there is a bridge. So the Germany targeted that bridge. And there was a tactical war. The British had to fight to secure the bridge, but later on, the Germany were ejected, particularly when General Smart came all the way from South Africa. He had dealt with the Germany in Namibia, and therefore he understood their war technique. He managed to push them out of that territory. They also raided the British forts, such as Kichwa Tembo. Kichwa Tembo is a fort inside Savo, Mzima Springs Fort, and Crater Fort. But one thing I want to mention is that from Taveta, the war spread all the way to Migori. Kisii, Masailand, and Kwale. So all those became battle sites, and they will be very important when it comes to the absence of Africans in this war, or the absence of the African people in the war. Now, history has, and it has proven that Africans were part of this war. As it went on, Africans were active players in this war, in as much as they are absent. Apart from the ones from Nyanza, Kenya, they call it Kenya when you check the archival reports, Central region, which encompassed the Gikuyu, the Ukambani province. Others came all the way from India. We had soldiers who were brought in from India. And I have a reason why I'm mentioning India, as you see. They came all the way from India. Others were recruited as far as Zimbabwe. We had Africans who were brought in as far as Zimbabwe, Nigeria, Nyasaland, Rhodesia, Malawi, and South Africa. To add on the East African people who are also taking part in this conflict or in this war. Now, I must say that this war led to a lot of casualties, and that is where now, that is what is leading me to the absence of the Africans. Casualties. Europeans died, Indians died, Africans died, but then we don't see the Africans in those landmarks. And the question is why? Well, those scholars have argued that the First World War itself was a racist war, starting from Europe, the way the British and its allies defined the Germany, racist, bad people, you know. So they carried that. It was a racist conflict in Europe, then it was transferred to the African region. So it had a lot of casualties. And among the casualties were the Indians. Many of them died. The British themselves also lost lives. The Boers from South Africa lost lives. The African natives from South Africa lost lives. Now, you might wonder, why am I bringing in African natives from South Africa? Now, if you go to those graves or the landmarks in Voi, Kasigao, Makitao, Taveta, you will see South Africans who are buried there. Povonsa, a South African. He's buried there and the grave is marked for Bonza. There are some Africans there, but from South Africa. Where did the East Africans go? When it comes to, because you are putting Africans there, but from South Africa. We'll say this is a driver. But where are the East Africans? That is where my question is. Or can somebody say they were not involved? Let's see. If they were not involved, let's see if they are not involved. If we revisit the colonial records, and many scholars such as Geoffrey Hodges, he discusses that Africans were part and parcel of this war. And he goes ahead to give the statistics. He acknowledges that Africans from East Africa were actors in this war. And Rudyard Kipling also acknowledges that. And he says, carrier corps or carriers were the feet and hands of the army. They were part and parcel of the army. But then they were conscripted in thousands. They were conscripted in thousands, trained, and taken to the war front. Not only in East Africa, even outside East Africa, they were taken to the war front to fight alongside the British. They were recruited, and a file, a colonial file, MS 5461/1, file 1, has some names from African who are conscripted. It has names from Ukambani province, Nyanza province, and Kenya province. It has those names. So the British cannot tell us that they didn't know the names of these Africans. That file has the names. The sad part of it is the last time I saw that file in the National Archive, but when I went there recently, as I was preparing to do this, it is missing. All the files that have names are actually missing, including a huge book which had the names. It is still missing, and they cannot trace it. I don't know where it went. This file indicates that Africans from Ukambani province, Nyanza, Kenya province, fought in areas such as Namanga, Longido, Arusha, and Tabora. That they fought there. It also emphasizes that they fought in Voi, Mbuyuni, Maktau, and Moshi. Some of them fought in Mombasa, Gazi, Vanga, and Umba. It says that the files have even narratives, and one of the interesting narrative is from a man called Wanyande from Usonga. And Wanyande says he was conscripted. At that time, when they were going for them, they will talk to the chiefs, and the chief will tell the elders to give the rogue boys, the rogue children, and hide the good ones. The same file states that the Kisi had refused to be recruited, but the British lied to them. They lied to them for a meeting, and once they were in a meeting, they were conscripted by force and became all the way to fight. They were conscripted by force. They were lied to, just come over. And in some extent, the files indicate that they rounded out villages. Then they selected. All people worked to supply food. The healthy young ones were taken by force. And a good example is actually describes another file MS 54, MSS 5469 stroke 353. It describes how they conscripted the Gikuyus from Kikuyu by force. And actually, the church also took part, so they cannot tell us that they didn't know the names of those who went to fight, because the church was also recruiting. The British churches were also recruiting. And in this file, they describe how Kikuyus were recruited, how the Kisi who rebelled were conscripted and led them to fight. And it also tells the role of the church in recruiting and the formation of the Kikuyu mission volunteers. They called them volunteers. Look at the way they are choosing the names, Kikuyu mission volunteers, that they are volunteering to go and fight. I am still asking myself, somebody from Kiambu volunteering to go and fight at the coast, and they managed to recruit 40,000 Kikuyu men from Kikuyu alone. And that was the role of the church to recruit all these. Hodges, and in this file, they also explain the training that first they were taken to the first carrier depot, which was in Nairobi, in the present day Karioko market. And then some of them who are conscripted from the coast were trained at Karioko in Mombasa. We also have Karioko in Dar es Salaam. And all here, the Africans were being trained. Then after that, they were deployed to engage in a war. And as I said, that one soldier was assigned 15 carriers. And if we had 125,000 British soldiers, then you can do that math and know how many Africans were assigned as carriers. And they did the following duties, that they were frontline porters. They were machine gun carriers and ammunition carriers. They were stretcher bearers. That means they were also picking the dead bodies of the Europeans. Now then, you pick the dead body of a Briton, which finds itself in a marked grave, and the African is absent. The soldier dies, he's given a label. But when the African dies, he's not given a label. When Dr. Ondigi was speaking about the railway, somebody stated that, look here, maybe the Taitas were not burying the people. Remember, the carrier corps were not just coming from Taita. They were coming from all over the country. In fact, in Uganda, the British recruited or conscripted 130,000 Ugandans who were brought to fight. As I said, some of them came as far as Malawi, some of them came from as far as Zimbabwe. Of interest then, these files also indicated the names of Africans who took part in recruitment. And one of the names is Chief Kadima of the Wanga, who was conscripting Africans there. And Chief Kadima of Wanga. And in fact, in one of the files, there is a survivor called Odandayo Mukwenje Agweli, who actually even names the people they were fighting with. And that therefore means no one can say the British did not know the names of the Africans who were involved in that war. So where are the Africans? To answer that question, or to strengthen what I am saying, let us go to the slides. Let's start. I want to sum it up on a pictorial. Let's go to the first slide. Just want to explain it. The first one. This is the map. This is the map depicting the positions. The Skambi Marabu, the British position. Losioto Hill, British position. Mzima Fort, Crater Fort, Kichwa Tembo Fort, Maktau. Maktau means mark time. This is where the British were taken before they proceed to the borderline where they were to fight the Germany, Now, after the Germany pushing them off, then you'll see that this became the Germany positions. The second slide. The second slide is a brief history of the war in pictorial. They are giving timelines as the war progressed on. So if you read it, you'll see from July and as it went on. Then the other. Now, if you look at this caption, it states that 15 followers were assigned to one fighter. So one British soldier was assigned 15 followers. These are the carrier corps. And that gives you the statistics that I was talking about. Now, as I said, we had Indian soldiers who are brought in from India. If you look at, by the way, this collection is in Salt Lake Hotel. And if you look at this collection, you'll see an Indian soldier on one side and an African porter on the other side. Now, if these two died, then this one ended up in a cemetery labeled with his name, and this one, no. The African, no, he's no one. Let's go to the other. Now, this is of interest. Again, they are now giving a rough estimate of the Africans that took part in that war, particularly from Kenya. Now, this is strictly Kenyan, saying this World War exhibition mounted to honor 1 million Kenyans involved in East African campaign of World War I. And they are asking you and I to donate. So anytime they are mentioning Kenyans, they want donations. So that if you go there, donate so that we, let's go on to the other. Now, you'll see African porters, as Rogers says, they were men who are walking without shoes, without boots, without special uniform, but they are here fighting. You can see them carrying the load, and they could 125,000 kgs could be carried per day by the African porters who are attached to the British. But then all these carriers are missing in any record. Let's go to the other one. Still showing. You can see of interest, Bishop Frank Weston, leader of Zanzibar Carrier Corps. That's the role of the church in recruiting the fighters. Now, the bishop has a name. The Africans have no name. The porters have no name. Now, but then here you'll see the name. Africans seem to have been singing as they carried the Lord, and they say, "We are porters. We carry food. We carry food. Marching song of Ugandan carriers, Ugandan carriers, but they will just give a general identity, Ugandan carriers, no name attached on it. Now, I explained, let's go on, please. These are still the carriers, you can see carrying the load and the number. So let's go to the next. Now, these are British forts. This fort still stands at Picket Hill. As you can see, Picket Hill. And what I'm pointing here is a gun position. A gun position because the German fort is just few kilometers away. So when they are here, they could hit the Germany position. And so these rocks were the British defensive forts, which are well, they are still intact. Let's go to the next. But before we get to this, let's go to this one first. Then I'll come back to this to explain. Now, this is Taita Hill. Taita Hill is Slaughter Hill. Slaughter Hill because what the Germany did, they dug trenches at the foot of the hill. And then they also dug other trenches at the top of the hill and mounted their guns at the foot of the hill and put dummies here. So anytime the British were fighting, they were fighting the dummies, but the German were hiding down here. They ended up killing many British soldiers. They killed more than 3,000 on this alone. Now, if the Germany killed 3,000 British soldiers, do a rough mathematics times 15 porters. That will tell you a rough number of Africans that were then slaughtered. They have erected a cross. There's a cross on that hill, which marks the, which depicts the massacre, or they remind themselves of the massacre. Now, at this time, the British were not able, therefore, to hit the Germany or to eject the Germany here. And this will then lead us to this photo. The British were therefore forced to bring in a plane, which was assembled at the gates of Savo West. This is the gate of Savo West, and it is a runway. Up to now, it is also used as a runway. So the first plane was assembled there and used for reconnaissance on the Germany position. That is when they learned that they are fighting dummies. The Germany are taking cover under the foot. The next, please. These are just remnants of war. The bomb remnants, the bullets, they are still lodged in this hill. But you don't carry them away because it's part of our history. Interestingly, we always associate it with the European history. The African is also still missing in this. Next, please, this one now. This is a German fort at Taita, a German fort at Taveta, actually. This fort is still intact, built very well with rocks, 1 meter wide, and it has 4 gun positions so that the Germany could hit the British on Picket Hill, could hit the British on the Picket Hill. Next. This one you have seen it, all of you have seen it. It is on Kenyatta Avenue. Written on, when you fight for your country, even if you die, your grandchildren will remember your name. Where is the name? That's why I went to pick it. Where is the African name? So the grandchildren will remember which name. There's no name attached on it. So generally, Africans are absent. Mactau. Just move next, please. This is Mactau military tank. The British constructed it. Again, Africans are the ones who offered the labor, but they are absent. The names of the commanders are the ones highlighted on those structures. Next. Now, as you can see, the Indians who fought were buried and their graves are well maintained and labeled with their names on. The Indian graves are in Mactau. The Indian landmarks are also in Taveta, labeled very well. The British ones are in Voi, they are also in Taveta. And if they had girlfriends who died during the war, they were also buried outside this cemetery, but well maintained. They are labeled. No, European girlfriends, not Africans. The only Africans who are labeled, who have names, are the ones who came from South Africa. And there are very few. There are very few. So if they had girlfriends, they are buried outside. If they had babies, the babies are also buried outside the cemetery and labeled. But the African, no. As you can see, I picked just a random pick. You can see this is 11th Regiment South African. The name is Arends. And then a South African, these are Boers were brought in. Let's see this. The next. The next is an example of an African driver from South Africa. His name is Mokoyoni. Mokoyoni, that one is labeled. But the Kenyan ones or the East Africans one are missing. Now, the only mark, this is now also what interested me. If we go, let's go to this. When you interview the people, the locals will tell you that this is a mass grave where the East Africans were buried. They say, wako kwa hiyo mlima, unaona hiyo heap? And this heap is just next to Voi military cemetery. Actually, there is a fence here. It's only that the camera did not capture it. There's a fence here. So this is, they will tell you how many watu wetu walizikwa hapo in this heap. No name, it's just a heap. But next, a British cemetery. The only landmarks that tell about Africans are these. Let's go to these. This is a landmark at Mwashoti, unnamed African soldiers. When you go home, tell them of us. I'm asking who? Tell them of us and say, for your tomorrow, we gave our today. For your tomorrow, we gave our today. Remember, we will never break the faith with you. That is the only landmark that, and this portrait here. And this landmark and portrait is in a game reserve, it is in a national park. Just deserted there in a national park. The place is called Mwashoti. Mwashoti means no more shots. This is where the British were arrested. That's where they have erected these two pillars as a sign of the African present. Next. I brought this deliberately because when Dr. Ondigi was presenting, somebody raised and said, maybe because the Taitas were not burying their people. That therefore took me to this position to ask, is it true? And they told me that the people whose skulls are taken in this hill, there are skulls here, these are the skulls, whose skulls are kept here are known people of the Taita. not anybody else. You cannot pick a body, a skull of a body in a forest and then take it there. This is their sacred place, and they keep, this is at Kishamba. Now, to emphasize my point that they knew the names of the African potters or African fighters is this caption of Nguku Mulwa, an Akamba, who said the whistling of the bullets could be heard in the air. Shoo, shoo. That's what they have marked, but the name is there. The rest, there are no names. That means, therefore, they deliberately left African names. Next, please. I mentioned that a British soldier fired the first bullet that sparked the war. This bullet was fired in this structure, and it is in this window that he fired the bullet. Tanzania is just a stone throw from here. So he fired from here, killing Frederick, a German soldier, and that is what sparked the East African campaign. Next. Next is Kwamashoti. Kwamashoti, this is where the pillar is that recognizes Africans. There's no structure there. It's just these pillars. And this is the British camp. This is where their fort was. You can see there how they dug the trenches to take cover. Next, please. The same unnamed African soldier, when you go home, tell them. That's the repeated narrative on those pillars. These are Germany forts. After the Germany hit the British at Kasgau, then they took over for some time, but later on they were pushed out of it. This tree is the boab, the sniper's boab. A story is told that a Germany lady visited the boyfriend who was a soldier, and then the boyfriend was killed. So the lady was hiding inside here and massacred so many British soldiers as they passed by. This graveyard is for the people of Kashmir, the soldiers that were brought in from Kashmir. It is labeled and their names are written on, but the African one were not written on. The big question is, was it racism even in death? Was it racism even in death? And the Africans, as I said, they even know, when you check the files, they even say, they talk about the commanders who are leading them. For example, there's one they nicknamed Bwana Mukia. Bwana Mukia was a British commander. They nicknamed him Bwana Mukia because he had whisk, and then he also remained behind. That means before you reach him, you will have killed so many Africans. So they call him Bwana Mukia. And the people of Uyoma also remember this interview, or this file captures somebody from Uyoma who talks about Bwana Mukia, a British soldier who was commanding many of the Africans. So finally, I say that the only mark for Africans are those pillars. So the big question is, where is the name for the Africans? The research is still ongoing. And we will bring a lot from it. Thank you very much.
Can we give our presenter a more hearty clap? I think he has done a very good job. He has painted a very vivid picture of the so-called East African campaign. He has run us through the historical background to the acquisition of colonies in East Africa. And of course, throughout the presentation is the very striking tragedy of the war itself, the toll that it took, fought by thousands of Africans who had very little or no clue over what the war was all about. Indeed, this campaign has frequently and inaccurately been dubbed as a sideshow. I've seen that in texts, that it was a sideshow to the main theater. The main theater, of course, in this case, being the war that was being battled out in the European Western Front and other places. And in my mind, listening to Neville Masika, I think that utterly diminishes and trivializes the enormity of what it is that he has tried to take us through visually in the 4 years that the war lasted. And therefore, I would venture that our discussion this afternoon raises some very pertinent questions that historians grapple with all the time. And this is what I would like perhaps to dwell a little upon, because we have heard, we have seen, you can ask him questions on the main discussion, but I would like to address some of the issues that I think have presented themselves out of this discussion this afternoon. And of course, the very first one is the question of memory in history. Because at the very basic, history is about memory and the intersectionality between the past, the present, and the future. I think that cannot be denied. So when Masika talks about the absence of Africans in the heritage of the war, he's talking about that memory, the importance of memory. And why is memory important? Because memory is a means to address the past. It is a way of grappling with issues related to the past. But we also know that memory is riddled with landmines, at least in history, I know that for sure, especially because of the multiplicity of factors that inform historical processes. It's never a given. There are never simple answers to that. And the heritage that he talks about is part of humanity's inheritance, which we have an obligation to pass on to generations to come. So he's asking again pertinent questions. These nameless African soldiers, what is it that we are passing on? He's talking about a forgotten heritage. Even as we see a whole wealth of data that he has collected in the field, it is a forgotten heritage. And therefore, I would place his discussion this afternoon promptly as one that seeks to remember the unremembered. How do we remember the unremembered? Because I think that is at the core of the questions that he's raising this afternoon. But then if we are grappling with memory, which is what we have been doing for the last 40 minutes, the question is, who organizes and arranges that memory? Question number one. For whom is that memory organized? By whom? And for which individual and collective objectives? Why is it being done? And this is not an idle question. It is indeed a very weighty question, because intrinsic to that question can be all sorts of leads to the question that he's asking. For example, in Taita and in regard to World War I, has there been culpable erasures, deliberate erasures? Has there been deliberate omissions? Deliberate omissions. I've heard him talk about registers and names of conscripts. So it is not that the names are not known, but there is a deliberate effort to omit those names. And I would imagine that is why he's talking about race and the racial angle to the First World War. There are also what I would call convenient silences in history, right? Just convenient silences. It's not convenient to talk about certain things. And I think this is also what happens concerning the issues that Mwalimu has been raising this afternoon. Now, the presentation, I think, also speaks to a wider concern. That absence of African agency, I think, is a reflection of a wider concern raised by African historians and Africanists, and more explicitly addressed from the 1960s. And the concern was that, as constructed, African history is a byproduct of relations of domination and exploitation. And maybe in that, we may begin to understand why we have the absences that he is talking about. So yes, there is that domination, exploitation, especially in the colonial venture. We see a dynamic structure of power relations, and I think some of the historical distortions and absences and silences can be traced to that structure of power relations and the silences that we see or listen to in African history. So in my view and in my thinking, the absence of African agency is a silence. I would call it a silence. A silence of how a particular group of people is represented to the world. And Masika is asking us to read the silence, to read the silence. This might fool us, all the pictures we have seen, but those pictures are also blind. They are also full of silences in the lack of representation of African agency. Now, beyond the facts and figures, and Mwalimu has given us a lot of figures, it is a bit controversial. My figure is that the Kenyan porters who actually died, the Kenyan porters were upward of 45,000, give or take. And 45,000 was about 1/3 of the country's total adult male population. If that might give you some picture of the tragedy and the toll that the world took on the country, not just on East Africa, but on the country that we call Kenya. But beyond these facts, this is also a human story, what you may call a human story. It's not about facts, it's not about figures alone. For example, How did the African soldier or carrier define? How did the potter understand in their own flesh and mind what they were fighting for? I think that is the real tragedy, because you can fight for something and be happy to fight and die for that. But what were these potters and carriers fighting for? Now, I don't want to take up all the time, we need questions, but tied to that, when you walk to CBD, those who are here and those who know our city well, you find what Mwalimu has pointed out as the African War Memorial, Monument. I don't know how many of you have actually walked there and looked up, because you have to look up, and I would ask you, what do you read when you see those three Africans in that monument? Why was this African memorial dedicated to the carrier horse? By the way, it was erected in 1928, a time when the city was zoned in racial profile. And it was erected not in carrier corps, where the Africans were being recruited. It was actually erected on Delamere Street, where the Africans, indigenous Africans, could not on a good day walk and remember or read, if they could, what Kipling, the poem that Kipling has put there dedicating to the carrier corps. So, Mwalimu, what is the value of a visual image? Maybe you'd like to answer that. How do we animate heritage so that it's not just a structure? How do we animate it so that it can speak to us, so to speak? I believe, and Mwalimu has hinted that this is not a done case. I believe there's a lot of inventory of World War I that can and should continue. So this is an incomplete historical project, and it offers a lacuna to redress some of the invisibilities that Mwalimu has talked about. Africans name their children for themselves so that my name may not be forgotten. Name, Mwalimu, what is in a name? Is it possible for us to retrieve some of these documents and at least do a little bit in providing some sort of memorial that can connect even emotionally to our lost soldiers? And finally, of course, we talk about tangible and intangible heritage. Mwalimu Nyanchoga is here. I'm sure he may want to say something on that. So there's a lot of grounds also in intangible heritage that we can address in regard to perhaps beginning to do a little more towards bridging the absence and the invisibility that Mwalimu Masika has talked about this afternoon. Thank you very much. I'll leave my thoughts there so that we can open our discussion to the members, the attendees in the room, but also those online. Thank you. So we'll take the questions, take 3 questions, 4 questions. We'll give Mwalimu a chance to respond. We take another round and then we shall go to those online and see if they would like to ask questions or make comments on the same. So we have Mwalimu Ben. He will start us off. We have Mwalimu Ken. We have Professor Wahome. I think we can take those three and then take another round. Yes, Ben.
Thank you very much, Dr. Masika, for a well-researched presentation. I really don't have a question, but I have a concern on two issues. Issue number one relates to what you call the landmarks, the African landmarks. And when I looked at them, I was asking myself that we as historians, and maybe archaeologists by extension, we should be able to be told perhaps when whether these landmarks have been dated. Because some of those landmarks you presented there, they look as new as if they were done just this year. So would there be, a case of people coming in the recent past and adding their own information there and therefore concealing the truth? So dating is indeed very important in history. Then secondly, I also wanted to ask about the concern of the absence of the African agency in relation to the graves. You see, those of us who come from an archaeological background, and we have studied the history of East Africa, could it be that there is a cultural aspect, cultural affinity, that those survivors, the Africans who survived in the war, could have suggested that, our departed, colleagues should not be, the graves should not be as conspicuous as those ones of the Europeans. Because where we have come from as Africans, we know that it is very rare really to conspicuously display the graves of the departed among many African societies and indeed East African societies. So you also need to look at that. Thank you very much. Those are my two concerns.
Maybe I stand. Thank you, David. This was very eye-opening. I happen to be privy to the work that you are doing in Taita Taveta. And I have just two comments and two quick questions. First one, you ask a very interesting question, and it touched me so much. Where are Africans? As bullets, where are Africans? I felt like this is an indictment to us historians. We have waited for far too long to write this narrative, or so I felt. And I want to thank you for making us start. And also is an indictment to the past administrations in this country. Where are the attempts to decolonize, officially decolonize some of these monuments? And Dr. Gachie talked about memory. It's part also, I think, of the role of African governments to tell our story, at least. There's also a way in which that question raises very interesting issues about the role of the church in the whole welfare, what one could call the welfare of colonial subjects. When you showed us the photograph of a bishop, it came to my mind that bishops are meant to lead people to heaven. Now they were leading them to to war. But that is a story that is a question that has, connotations of discrimination, selective amnesia, which Maggie was talking about, and also, silences that seem to suggest that historians who have been part of the conspiracy to silence some narratives. So fellow historians, there we are. The second comment is, I liked your dictionary definition of the concept, the followers. And I wanted to suggest that that is wonderful, that's fantastic. But maybe you also need to think of contextualizing it to really come out clear for what it was. Because they were followers, because they were subservient, literally. They were just slaves on the hands of their so-called superiors. They were alienated from their own families. I could imagine somebody from the highland, in the Kisii Highland where I come from, all the way to Taita Taveta. I lost my step-grandfather in this campaign. Probably is one of those whose bones are in that heap that you showed us. I don't know whether you saw any name closer to mine. So I thought probably you need to emphasize, other than the admiring that you really emphasize, that is the dictionary definition, but also the word followers could connote subservience, the subordination of Africans to all other social groups, the alienation, domination, and control. I thought that was important. And now to my very few small questions. One is the World War, the term World War, the First World War and the Second World War. Essentially these were European conflicts. They could recruit a few allies, within Europe and in other areas. But this was a European conflict. Even here in East Africa, there was a conflict between the Germans and the British, really. The only thing is that it was a conflict that was fought in many fronts. A European conflict fought in many fronts. What is it? Have you found anything in your research that qualifies this to be called a world war? Maybe you can help us. Why can't we use concepts that exactly say what this was? Have we fallen victim of the hegemonic reconstruction of the past, which is aimed at assuaging the egos of those who caused these conflicts and killed many people? That after all, we were not the only ones. It was a world war anyway. And finally, is something that Dr. Maggie, alluded to, historical memory, collective memory, how people tell the stories of this war. Are there portraits today among the Taitas and Tavetas that clearly depict that they have in their own identity today the effects of this campaign? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ken. Professor?
Yes, I think a number of questions have been asked, but there is one outstanding issue that was raised by Masika on the disappearance of records in the archives. I think that is a serious issue because it means that this is a living kind of heritage in that sense of records disappearing. And I think it is important to know in which conditions records would disappear in the archives. I don't know, because they are supposed to be documented in microfilms. And I think that's a level that might need further investigation. There is also the issue of the survivors. This population was about 1.8 million. The population almost about 2 million in total. So there must be those who died and those who survived. And I think that is an area that may require some investigation. Of course, we don't expect them to be alive, but we know they moved from one point to another. How are they moved? And who did that movement? Did they just evaporate? I think that is an area that may require further investigation. I also think that Indians occupied a very prestigious position in the colonial government. And this also happens in the Second World War. You find some of the people involved directly, yet command units are actually Indians. I think the documentation of Indian fighters, therefore, would be explained by the position they had already occupied from the time of the construction of the railway line. And this continued. Actually, by this time, Indians were already thinking of Kenya as the possible country that they can occupy and replace the Europeans. And therefore, they had a very serious, until the Devonshire White Paper. That's the time we start seeing the position of Indians being challenged. So then, if we are looking purely at the history as the story of the big people, of the big man, and heritage as the history of the big man, then it follows that in the mix, Africans were lost. And I think it is important to look at that angle. So I think it is more about the position of Africans at the time and the relationships that existed. If you go beyond that and go to the planning of the city of Nairobi, you see those relationships. I think they were alluded to by Margaret. So you'll see those relationships where the Africans occupy the poorest position in this city and the Europeans take the lion's share. So I would also expect that in this naming, the Europeans will take the lion's share, the Indians will take the next big position, and then the African will be somewhere forgotten. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Prof.
Thank you very much. Most of them were comments, but I would like to say something about some of those comments. Dr. Gashi mentioned the male population, and Dr. Gashi mentioned the male population, and I want to relate that with the question that the observation by the chair, Dr. Ombongi, where he is saying that the portrait of Africans, what do they think about this? If you interview the people of Taita or the Taita people, they will tell you that their population is too low because of the effect of the war. Some of them will say, look at our population. It is low because most of our men were taken to take part in the war. And to tie it again on the question of portrait, what is in the mind of the people, if you go to villages in Kasigao, they have the narrative of how they were chained, their elders were chained, and how they were taken all the way to Malindi. So they have the images with them. But that then takes me to the question, to the observation again by Dr. Gashi, and that was a question also. What is the value of the image? And he cited the image on the current Kenyatta Avenue. Daktari, interestingly, that image is in Kenyatta Avenue, and it was erected at a time when the Africans could not access that space. Now, one funny thing is that even the images or the portraits that have this African story in Taveta, most of them are in the national park. Again, accessing them is a major problem. Mwashoti is in the national park. You cannot walk there. There are wildlife all over. So generally the African portraits seem to be in the national park. And that takes me to the issue of who erected that image and what was the motive behind erecting that image? For his own good, just to show the world that Africans were also in this. So don't blame us, as Dr. Mbongi said, don't blame us. Africans were also party and parcel of this conflict, of this conflict. So it depends with who is erecting that image and what is the intention of that. On the issue of names, interestingly, and I want to rob in the idea, the landmarks, as Mwalimu or Dr. Ben said, that some of those landmarks are recent. Yes, the ones constructed in the park are very recent. The pillars. I think after a lot of noise that where is the African, then they decide to put a pillar there. That look here, you are represented in this pillar. So those are very recent, but the forts are old. The forts are old, and some of them have been secured so that you don't interfere. Some of them are under the museums of Kenya, so you cannot interfere with them. Then you mentioned the cultural issue, although it was a suggestion, but then these Africans that were conscripted, it wasn't their wish. Some of them never returned. And I think even the labeling of these graves is borrowed heavily from the conventions, the world conventions that talk about war. We might think that maybe the Geneva Conventions began in 1949, but then they date us back as the days of Henry Dunant. That is when they passed the first convention, which demands that you label. If a soldier dies, you label, and the family members should be allowed to access. The big question is, did Africans, the chair has said here that he lost his grandfather. What are the villagers in the Kisii territory saying? Alipotea. Alienda tu yule alipotea. You know, some Africans would say alipotea, alichukuliwa na akapotea, akaenda akapotea. It wasn't their wish. It is the wish of the British to conscript them and take them to the war front. And that then leads us to what Professor has raised, that history of the mighty, the big boys, the big man's history. Then I weave that again with Dr. Mbongi's question, observation. Should we then perpetuate the narrative of the colonial administrators that we are absent in this and therefore should not tell the story of the small man? The small man is also represented. And I think Hodges puts it very clear that, look here, they were the foot, the hands that fed the army, that fed the army. Why are they absent? So that narrative needs to be told. And that goes again to the government. This is just a comment because the chair was just commenting on this. The African governments that took over, they have not done any effort. In fact, anytime there is a celebration to mark the end of the First World War in Taveta, KDF parades and actually honors the British and the Indians. KDF also does not bring Africans on this. It doesn't. It honors the British and they also forget the Africans. And that's why it's a challenge to us. Should we tell the story of the Africans? It needs to be told. Was it a world war? Again, who coined the term world war? The big man. And therefore forced all of us in it. So the chair, I pose the question back to have historians failed to redefine the war. Maybe I can pose it back that way. Thank you. I think most of them were just observations. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Mwalimu, for your very erudite answers or responses to the comments and the questions raised. Now we're going to take questions for our colleagues, peers, and friends who are online. And we shall ask them to unmute so that we can hear their questions. We'll go by Professor Parker Shipton. We can see you and your hand is up. So you will go first, followed by Professor Kukubo Barasa. His hand is also up. And then we can take a question from Dr. Mshai Mwangola, and a fourth one from Dr. George Hay in UK, I believe. And Jeff Usaji.
Thank you very much. I will add a comment and a couple of questions from what I hope to be is a neutral perspective in a place called New England. It is still called New England, even after people here fought like crazy to get out of England's colonial domain. First of all, congratulations on a very convincing presentation with, it seems to me, watertight argumentation and vivid evidence. All, I'm totally convinced by what you say. Now, you've got me persuaded to believe that selective memorialization, I would call it a selective memorialization and silencing, as our commentator has added, it is something like an active case of silencing. Now, my question about memorialization is this: does it glorify war and fighting? Does memorializing the war dead incentivize recruitment, including voluntary recruitment? Does it make it, does it offer young people an avenue toward immortality that they might not otherwise perceive and be inclined to accept? In other words, does it help cause more wars, more fighting, more killing? Dr. Mbongi has anticipated my question about the naming of wars. World War, yes, it seems it's not a war caused by Papua New Guinea or Chileans or Argentinians or Hawaiians. Right, but are African people really being forced, as you say, to really being forced to use that term, or can we maybe hear from you an alternative? It's a good idea, I think. Next, the use of crosses as memorials. Whom do those glorify? How African is the referent of those? Finally, what languages ought to be used in memorials where the words are concerned? Ought they be local languages? Ought they to be local languages? Finally, us, I guess I'll add one more after finally. The use of us and them, we and they, us and them, we Africans, we Europeans, we Americans, us, those Europeans, those English, those this. Are we all just doing something we shouldn't be doing when we keep using us and them and we and they? And how do we proceed without doing that? Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Professor Kukubo Barasa, please.
Thank you. Mine is not a question, but a comment. And this comment is not so much a controversy or anything. It's just something that Dr. Masika's presentation brought up from my memory. Where I grew up in Sirisia, Western Kenya, there was a man, a veteran of the war of 1914 to 1920, and he acted in the most fascinating way. And we, as children, were fascinated in the 50s and 60s by what he did. Now, Dr. Masika's presentation puts in place some of those things that I was always fascinated about. This man was known as Wanjala wa Wamana. And I cannot forget that because every morning without exception, he came to his friend's doorstep and did a single parade, a single person parade, as they did in the army, and announced his name in full and his service number. This I saw from the time I began to hear up to the time I was at the end of high school when he died. And that really fascinated me. I've forgotten the number now, but I remember the names very clearly. This man knew all the railway stations, first of all, the Voi Taveta line, and then he knew all the stations in Tanzania, and all the stations in Kenya, and all the stations in Uganda, one way and the opposite way. I don't think there are many people who can give you that sort of knowledge as this man, Wanjala Wamana, did. He was ceremonial, and interestingly, at every ceremony, he carried a fly whisk. Maybe he worked with Wanamkia. He was always, he lived in a little house which was booby-trapped, and only a few of us had been trained on how to get to his doorstep, because we used to take him some food sometime, and he had trained us on how to avoid the booby traps and get to his house. And it was serious business, it wasn't a joke. He said many times before he died on his morning parades that he would not be buried in the rural area on his piece of land. So he sold the piece of land about 20 years before he died. And he had, as he had demanded, his friend, who was a chief, accepted to bury him in a one-person cemetery. I don't remember anybody else who has been buried in that cemetery at the current Sirisia County Administrative Center. This man is very well known, was very well known as Mr. Kawongo, that's a nickname, apart from his number, Wanjala Wamana. I believe if there is somebody from National Defense University, they should take interest in people who laid the foundation for themselves, for the military, and who struggled singularly to keep the memory without literacy, without the digitization, just straight from the head, and nobody seems to have paid attention to them. I recall that every time the British Army during the colonial times came around the area, he always marched with them at the rear, and the British soldiers and officials tended to see him as a clown and wanted to persuade the rest of us that we are dealing with a clown. But listening to Dr. Masika now, that man was a hero. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Barasa, for those very interesting recollections of Bwana Wamalwa. Now we take a question from Dr. Esther Mshai, if she's still with us.
I'm Mshai Mwangola. I think Dr. Esther is somebody else.
Go ahead.
Okay, so this is Mshai Mwangola. I don't know if I thought I was fourth, but so I hope I'm not jumping somebody who was coming before me. I just want to say, first of all, thank you so much. This has been an amazing presentation. And I'm going to ask for your pardon because unlike the first online speaker, I cannot claim a neutral position. So I'm going to just, first of all, start by stating my standpoint. While I cannot speak for the Taita Taveta, I am from Davida. So, and I'm also not from Kasigao. I'm not an expert at all in this, but I'm just really aware that I am not coming from a neutral position. And I'm really, really grateful because not just as I'm Davida, but also as a Kenyan, because I think one of the things that this presentation does is to take us into a history, as we have said, that's not known, it's not memorialized, it's got really important, I think, implications for how we look at history in Kenya, but also the reverberations of history in everyday life. I am conscious that this week we were told as Kenyans that history doesn't matter. And I think this is a presentation that reminds us why history really matters. And so I just wanted, first of all, just to think about why, for me, what you've done that I think is really, really important. I think when Kenyans mostly talk about going to war in the history books, we think about World War II. And we think about Kenyans leaving this territory and going outside. So the highlight that you have placed on the fact that Kenyans within Kenya were not only went to war within Kenya on our own land, but then they got lost, and that there are still families who don't know what happened to their ancestors, I think is really important and becomes something that we must ask, what does that mean? Even culturally for us as Kenyans, that there are people who left one part of the country, went to another part of the country, and their people have no idea what happened to them. I think it's important because when we think about how we engage with history and we talk about historical injustices and how this continues, the legacy of the colonial era continues in the present, we don't, for example, think about how we link the abuses of the British Army against the people of Kasigao, which you talked about, when we are talking about what is happening in Nanyuki with Batuk. And I think, what you demonstrated was this complete disregard for African lives and the lack of political, but also, the will of the elite in resolving these kind of injustices. So you kept repeating, and I was struck, you kept asking us about how do we know their names? These monuments tell us, do not forget us, but we don't know their names and we don't know their history. So actually the monuments are saying something that is not true, because most of us, and I'm speaking as somebody who comes from that county, that's my ancestral home, we don't think about it, we don't celebrate it, we don't consider these graves to be part of our heritage as a people. I know even when the centenary commemorations were going on, I know like the Taita Heritage Foundation tried to get more people from the county involved, but for many people, this was just something that, people from outside are coming here, and therefore it's about tourism. It wasn't about our own heritage. So I think the discussion that Mwalimu Gashie put on the table on memory and history, and the question she asked, what were they fighting for, is really, really important. I think it is at the center of why this history today is not important to us. And so that brings us to this question of how do we engage history and what is its significance? Because I think until we resolve that, this work, that even the work that you're doing, will be seen as inconsequential. And I think it is really, really weighty. That monument on Kenyatta Avenue, there's a poem I remember we learned when in high school. It was part of our literature set texts that was reflecting on that monument. And I've never forgotten, and this is over 30 years ago, I've never forgotten the lines of that poem. It ended by the words, "They fought and died for king against country, then came home and fought against king for country." And I think that is central to why this is not a memory Kenyans are comfortable with, because many people now see the people who fought for the British as betraying, as, you know, they were fighting on the wrong side. So I think that's something that I just wanted to put out there, and I want to thank you for putting that on the table. I also just wanted, and you know, linked to that, when you talked about, you brought the skull caves, the Taita skull caves, and it's very interesting for me, you know, how that was linked to the presentation on the railways, and this idea of, well, maybe the Taitas did not bury, and that, you know, these skull caves are now online for our World Heritage listing, because the Taitas had got very, very elaborate burial rites. And I remember, you know, I once asked people, how is it that these graves, the African graves, are so neglected? Why don't we care? And the response that came to me was, number one, this area is not seen as belonging to the county or the people. It is seen as belonging to the British, even to this day. And secondly, people said this is not a war that we are invested in. These people are not our people. And I think today, for the first time, as you talked about the pain of the Kasigao and the bitterness of the Kasigao around this, I think for the first time, that has made sense to me. And so one of my questions to you is, what does it then mean if we bring this up and we say this is important history for us, without resolving that for the people of this space, it is a history to which they carry a lot of bitterness? I know the Bakasigao are still asking for reparations. They're still asking for this to be listed as one of the historical injustices that were done against them. And until that is done, it feels to me almost like this discussion on this history is like, I don't know how to say it in English, where you're picking at a wound that has not healed, and then you're going to leave it bare, but not do anything about it. So I'd be interested in knowing what you think about that. And then secondly, from a cultural perspective, I'm thinking of Abdul Razak Gurna, the Nobel laureate, has a book called Afterlives. And I have to go back now and read that book, because he looks at the story of an ordinary askari, somebody who volunteers in Tanzania and goes off to this war. And every time I'm reading it, I've just realized I always imagined it as happening in Tanganyika. But today, when you were talking about the geography, I thought, oh my goodness, I wonder how much of that is actually, I wonder if he even got to that territory around Taveta. So I'm wondering if in your research, you are aware of any fictional writers, any contemporary artists who are engaging with this history, and what sources they're using.
Thank you, Dr. Mshai.
Yes, but can
Thank
I just ask you,
your...
I wonder if this would be helpful for you. Thank
Thank
you.
you very much. Thank you, Dr. Mshai. We'll take Professor George Hay and Dr. Jeff Usaji, and finish with Esther Award in that order. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and thank you to Dr. Masika for a really interesting paper. It's really hard for me to know where to start. I work for an organisation called the Commonwealth War Graves Commission. I'm their chief historian. We are the organisation that looks after that monument in Nairobi. There's a similar one in Mombasa. We refer to them, or they're often referred to as the Askari monuments. We also have an office and a cemetery on the Ngong Road, which if people haven't visited, I would recommend they do, because what it shows is the way in which this commemoration is supposed to take place. So that cemetery up at Ngong is a Second World War cemetery where you will find African soldiers buried appropriately with a headstone. What's fascinating about today, and what fills me with some joy and pleasure is seeing so many people engaged with this subject and animated by it, because it's something I've been working on for more than 3 years now. So in April 2021, my organization published a piece of research that I wrote along with my colleague John Burke, which picked this apart, something that we refer to as non-commemoration. So the organization is supposed to commemorate these people by name, either in a cemetery under a headstone, and if they couldn't do that for whatever reason, they should have put their names on a memorial. And as has been repeatedly shown here, that's something that they didn't do. That was a failure. It's too long for me to go into the reasons why, what we understand to be the reasons given, at least at the time, for not doing that. But it is a fact. So what I will do is I will drop a link to that report in the chat, and then also some of our other research outputs where we've done a lot of work in Mombasa, where we think we have the burial grounds of more than 1,000 carriers in service who died during the First World War. So we're quite far along with some of this research that ties directly into lots of what Dr. Masika is saying. And we have a team working from our Nairobi office, which, as I said, is on the Ngong Road, who are working in the field, looking for burial places. So I think it's something we have to link you up with them. I think it's really important because this work is already going on, and I think that's a connection that needs to be made. Is there a facility for me to share my screen? Would people be able to see it? Because there's something I'd like to show you in terms of records that might be of interest to everyone on the call. Is it a possibility? What I'll do it anyway, and then if people can see it, that would be great. If you can see this is what's called a death list produced by something called the Military Labour Bureau. It's one of very few that we've been able to find in the National Archives in Nairobi. You'll see it does everything we've already been discussing so far, which is name the men who died, where they came from, who they were, who their fathers were, when they died, how they died. So evidence of the fact that this material existed. The other thing I really wanted to share is the work that we're doing with the Kenya Defence Forces. So it's often been said, or it's certainly been said to me, that records for soldiers, so King's African Riflemen, men who are serving in military forces, Kenyans and others in East Africa, that their records don't exist. Well, we've been able to find those records with the Kenya Defence Forces, and so we're currently undergoing a digitization, which we're supporting.
Very much, Professor K. Thank you.
Could I just very quickly show you a picture of it, because I think it might be of interest. It's just they look like this. They're attestation and discharges, and they tell you everything about that man's service, where he came from, and critically if he died. So just to say, this has been fascinating, and I'm so pleased to see these discussions taking place in Kenya.
I'm sure when you're next in Nairobi, perhaps you'd like to present a paper.
I would be delighted.
For us. Thank you very much. We don't have too much time, so we move on to Jeff Osanji and Esther.
I hope you can hear me.
Keep it brief.
Can you hear me, Daktari? Can you hear me? I'm Jeff.
Yeah.
All right, thank you. Now, I appreciate Dr. Masika's brilliant research. I'm also persuaded that this erasing of Africans from European memory is not something unique. If you look at the Second World War, for example, you find that much of the movement in that war is associated or reported in history documents with the big generals. For instance, the Germans have associated their Africa Corps with General Rommel. In fact, he was a field marshal. They will say Rommel moved his tanks, he moved his battalions, he moved his regiments, he conquered the British. Then the British would associate their movements or their military prowess with Godfrey Montgomery, who was heading the Third Army in Egypt. The Americans who landed in Morocco associated their military with George Patton. And then, of course, the whole Allied group was under Dwight Eisenhower. So I see a tendency in the West to collapse the contribution of what I can loosely consider the lesser beings and subsume them under the bigger generals. Yet we know that the smaller beings are the ones who do the heavy fighting. There is an effort in the 1998 movie, the Hollywood movie by Steve Spielberg, named or with the title Saving Private Ryan. It is an attempt by Hollywood to recuperate this erased or silenced contribution by the junior officers, because a private is usually the junior most officer in the military. So in terms of recommendations, I'm wondering whether Dr. Masika's research has made any recommendations to our military planners and the Ministry of Defense on how to raise the image, the historical image of our junior officers who do the hard slogging in military battles instead of foregrounding generals. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jeff. We'll take the final question or comment from Esther Wall.
Thank you so much for the session. It's so interesting, and I'm really concerned. I do work with the World War I narratives, especially in relation to East African soldiers or prisoners. And as one of us has mentioned, that most of these soldiers never came back home. Most of them ended up in Europe, for example, in Germany, in France, and in Britain. And it is still the same issue when you go to the grave sites in Germany, or I was in Tanzania or in Kenya. There's that silencing bit whereby the narratives of the East African soldiers are silenced, while other dominant narratives, or what is considered as universal narratives in the global historiographies of World War I, are witnessed in these grave sites. So my question is, because I deal with more of the archives and maybe record keeping, I really want to know if, for example, the archive in Kenya, I haven't done so much with this archive. I have checked on the archives in Germany as far as these soldiers, the East African soldiers in the war is concerned, but there is still that bit of silencing, even in terms of record keeping. There is no much records that were left, or maybe the records were there, but as we know, some of these archival practices, that some records just don't make it to some point or to some level. So I don't know if it's a rule of those in power or who try to manage what is there to be kept and what is there to tell the stories of the past. So my question is the archive in Kenya has got this possibility of telling the stories of these prisoners of war? And it's also, I also find it important what Dr. Masika raised when he asked, is it really a world war? Or is it that there were participants and some people were just a part of it as victims, not as people, because you know this war really did not have the interest of some of the people who played a part in this war. So what is the situation when it comes to record keeping in the Kenya National Archive or in Tanzania or any other place? Because I've only witnessed the silencing within the grave sites. And I've also heard today, stories collected from the natives, maybe from Taita, which is also, I call it part of a really important history that has to be told. And lastly, what strategies or what decolonial strategies are we setting to deal with what is witnessed in the post-colonial time in terms of memorialization, or in terms of these sites which we call memory sites, or in the archives, or what the curators are doing in Kenya? Are there strategies that are being set in relation to this? Thank you.
Thank you very much. We appreciate the great comments that have been made, questions, and I'm sure Dr. Masika will do his best, but they are also very useful because this is an ongoing project. I'm sure they are going to go a long way in shaping the balance of the work that he's carrying out. Thank you. Dr. Masika?
Thank you very much for all that very rich insights about this work. Professor, you asked about if we talk about war or memorialization of war, are we not glorifying it? Yes, Professor Simpson. Are we not glorifying war? The answer is no. History, we learn history because we have to learn about the past. We have to understand the present. Why are we where we are? And therefore influence the future. Unless we learn that history, we cannot correct the past, or we cannot correct what was done in a wrong way. And that, therefore, means that we need to tell the story. I want to tie this also to the concern raised by, Mwangola, about the Kasigao people. The story has to be told about what they went through. The story has to be told because some of them perished in Malindi, some of them perished on the way, and their relatives are still asking. And that's why she said that it is still a bitter memory. So that bitter memory is not going to go away unless the story is told and the solution is found. So I think my opinion is the story must be told. Otherwise, it will not go away. And Prof also said, in which language do we bring out this narrative? I want to relate with the archival records. For example, if you picked a file on Mary girls in Taita, Mary Mary was a missionary. And what, if you go through that file, she's capturing the African names the way they were. Not even the European names there. They are capturing the African names. So-and-so was working on this school. So-and-so was working on this. By then it was called Coast Girls Wusi. But then you will see she is capturing the names of the locals the way they are supposed to be. So, Prof, those names, we just will bring them the way they are for them to have a meaning. And that also takes us to what Madam Mongola raised and said, sometimes even when those celebrations are being done there, the Taitas don't even take part because they say that is not part of us. It's because we have not brought them on board. They are not on board, so they don't understand why you want us to take part, and yet we are not represented. Awar raised a question on archives in Kenya and the silencing voices of Africans. I might want to think that the Europeans or the British knew very well that they transferred their war, the British and the Germany, on the African soil and forcefully brought the Africans in a conflict that they didn't know why were they even being forced in it in the first place. Today, if I forcefully came to your compound and caused damage there, I have a criminal penalty that will be slashed on me. So I'm just thinking aloud. Did the British then think that, you see, we have pulled these people in this mess? So if we give them a chance to know what we did, then they are going to take us to court. That might be my own thinking. It's not, I have not researched on that. So maybe that's why they are silencing, because they know the repercussion. Keeping in mind that they saw what happened even recently with Mau Mau people when they claimed compensation. Professor George Hay, very interesting and very welcomed. How I wish that you shared even the list with us, because that list, yeah? Oh, that's nice. Then we will pick on from there. If we pick several names, then we might trace the family. Africans have a way to trace their families. We will know where they come from. I think most of them were just comments. Maybe I just say a comment on Professor Kukubo's observation that this man said, you bury me in a one-man cemetery. Was he borrowing from the military? Had he seen what had happened in Taita? So he believed that as a soldier, you must be buried in a cemetery. And that also goes to the question that my senior Dr. Nyanjoga raised here, that Africans had no, they didn't want the memory of graves and everything. So that man seems to show that if I fought in the military, I should be buried this way. And therefore, that means Africans want their memory to remain. So I think we need to do much about the history. There's a hand there, I don't know.
Thank you very much for your ability to condense the comments and the questions. But I'm sure they are going to be very useful, like I said, to the ongoing work. We're going to do one final, very quick round, if there are any issues or questions. We have two, 1, 2, 3, in that order. Identify yourself, please, and ask your question.
Hey everyone. Hi. My name is Lily. I'm a student in my third year. Dr. Masika was my lecturer in the first year. So excited. Yeah. My first question is, do you think the government has intentionally ignored these events to maintain a good global economic interest? And also, how can Africa heal from what happened in a way that promotes healthy international relations? And the last one is, how does this historical event affect us now? Are they useful in any way, or are they just history events and they do not matter at all in this system in this time? Thank you.
Thank you very much. We are always very happy when our students participate in the discussion. Gentlemen, yeah, just.
Yes, thank you.
Could you please stand so that we can?
It's okay.
Yeah, thank you.
My name is Maeli Zared. I'm an alumni of the department. So my question is a follow-up on what Dr. Mbongi mentioned about in his second comment on the definition and the use of, the term follower on people that you have conscripted by force to fight or to participate in a war that they know little about. So my direct question is, in the native followers recruitment ordinance of 1915, that ordinance prescribed some little pay for Africans, specifically from East Africa. So my question is, what was the motivation or the justification of paying our people that you have taken by force? And if I use Dr. Mbongi's terms, you know, people you are holding in a form of slavery, why were they thinking about paying these people some little amount? What was the amount for? Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. We take the last question from Mwalimu Mary, I believe.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for the opportunity to ask a question. Thank you, Dr. Masika, for that presentation. Mine is actually not, I think it's more of a comment than a question, and arises from one or two things that you said. This were about racism, race. It was a racist war that was transferred to East Africa. And then again, there was mention of racism unto death. Racism unto death. And I'm looking at the entire presentation and seeing it in the light of not just power relations, but also in terms of racial relations. And in the first instance, then, maybe the concept of race as described in the first instance, it was a racist war, and then about the Africans coming in, racism unto death. That's a bit that needs, I felt needs a bit of elaboration as you work around it, because it takes us two ways. And that then would be the question of what is your conceptualization of race? What are you using to decide this race and this race? That conceptualization, I think, is very important right from the beginning. Secondly, any time that Africans talk about matters that involve the Europeans, there is that feeling that there was something that was done against us as Africans. And I'm now citing somebody who commented there, should it always be they and us as we talk about it? And I agree that it doesn't always have to be they and us, but this is history. The history tells us that there are these people from this side and these other people who are this side. These were the perpetrators and these were the
Thank you, Mwalimu Wanyoike. I like that you asked the question and also answered the question, I think, in an appropriate manner. I think we'll close the session there for the questions. We just give Mwalimu Masika a couple of minutes to respond, and then we shall close the session. Thank you.
Thank you once again. The first question was, is this a deliberate effort by government, or the government? And Dr. Mbongi had already asked the question. That question seemed to drive me to something which was not part of the debate, and that might be the people who took power after the colonial regime. Were they for Africans fully, or they were perpetuating the colonial interests? So if they were in the shoes of perpetuating colonial interests, then they will not revisit these issues, and they dismiss them as non-issues, as non-issues to them. For example, statements that can we forget and move on? So they blanketly might have advised that we just sweep it under the carpet. And that might have led to deliberate loss of this history or these histories. Deliberate loss because no one wants to look at it. For example, if a leader says, why should you study history? Where is it going to take you? Then you will realize that people might not follow that path, and therefore a lot will be lost. So I agree with you partly that sometimes governments after colonial rule deliberately did not want to bring these issues out because depending on who gained, where were they during the struggle? But that should not explain why we deliberately don't bring these issues out. If you go to the villages, people tell the stories. So the buck stops at historians. Have they gone to detail that history? That's where the buck stops. You also asked the question that how can Africans heal? Africans can heal if the story is told. And they understand that these things happen. For example, recently, an old man in the US who has been searching for the bones and the skeleton of his son who died during the Second World War. And why is he searching for the remains? Is that his son had left a will before he went to the war, that when I die, bury me next to my brother. And this old man felt that unless I bring those remains back home, I will not have peace. And finally, 2 years ago, he managed to trace the remains and buried them the way the son had said. And then he felt that I am now comfortable. I am at peace with myself. So for Africans to heal, we are not going to get those bones. But then the story should be told and the names, we give a name on the statistics. On the statistics. Then people will be like, yes, it is. Just like there were those heroes and heroines who struggled in this country. We might not tell where their graves are, but there is a name attached on it. Historians will talk about Meketili Liwamensa, they'll talk about Prophetess Mora. There's a name attached on it, and that brings comfort. That brings comfort. So the story should be told. How does all this affect us now? If we don't know where we are coming from, then we might not get where we are going. For any nation to develop, its people must know their history. Must know their history. And that's why we cannot develop unless we know our history. History is key. It details, it's good that you are in the Department of Economics, and when we are talking about economic development, why do we have to teach the economic history and say that, look here, these people learned from these challenges and that's why they are here. So we must learn from the past for us to get where we want to get to. Mr. Jared raised the issue of pay. It is in record that they were to be given some pay. But I'll comfortably tell you that later on after the war, this is also in record, the British dismissed the concept of pay, and this is what they said. Africans were fighting for their motherland and they don't need to be paid. They don't need to be paid. That's why when they came back, even those who went for the Second World War, they were not rewarded with land the way the settlers were. The soldier settlement schemes and whatever. The Africans went back to Mathare to survive there. So they later on dismissed and said there's no need, and that's from the governor, that there's no need to pay the Africans because they were fighting for their country. The question is, who was attacking the African country? That we leave it to ourselves to answer. Because were we fighting for our country? Yeah. And I think that is all. Dr. Wanyaike answered her question very well, so I don't need to repeat it again. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Masika. That was excellent. Your responses to the very many questions and comments your presentation has elicited. We're coming to a close of the session, and Dr. Gona will give a vote of thanks. But I just wanted to note that we should not forget that on the political scene in Kenya, 1918, it is no coincidence that the African political parties and organizations began to crystallize, to form after the First World War. And I believe that had quite a bit to do with at least the soldiers who had survived the war, but also the whole experience that Africans had been dragged into this war that was not their war. And now look at us here. We continue in this colonial bondage. So I think that interface is important to note that there were some positive outcomes from the war. Thank you.
Thanks, Margaret. Good evening, everybody. On behalf of our chair, on behalf of the department, on my own behalf, I'd like to thank you all for joining us this afternoon for this wonderful presentation by Dr. David Masika. I just wanted to highlight one thing that maybe you need to follow as I conclude my vote of thanks. There's a gentleman I think I've mentioned to you and Justice is called Clapperton Mavunga. Clapperton Mavunga. He's a professor of social medicine, like Mwalimu Ombongi. He's at MIT, and his first writings were on Dr. Livingstone and his exploits in the Zambezi Valley. And he dismisses him and gives prominence to the people of Zimbabwe as the true first tourist guides. And I think this is what David is doing. I think we need to hear more of the stories of the Taita and what they bring to the war than us lamenting whether this was racism or not. The point is, this was an encounter of the Taita people to a people who were invading their space, their landscape. I think that is the way Mavunga frames the ideas. Again, on behalf of everybody, thank you very much for gracing our seminar. This is continuing. David, you have energy. After completing a PhD in December, and you're on this platform, congratulations. Just as we're hearing next. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you. Good evening.